Good afternoon, everybody. We're just having some technical issues while starting. Can anybody please let me know if they're having any issues with the sound for the webinar? I was getting some feedback when I was testing it. So if you're not, please say no. If you are, please say yes in the chat section so I can see whether you're having any issues or whether you can hear me. Am I just like a moving mouth at the moment? No, can you hear me? Yes, you've got feedback, have you, Ashok? Or you can hear me. You can hear me. Okay, excellent. All right, thank you very much. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Oh, now we've got the wrong webinar coming up. Sorry, I just realised the wrong PowerPoint has just come up. So I'll just change that PowerPoint. Anyway, welcome back to our webinar for today. So today's webinar is we're actually going to go through how to do your CEO annual declaration of compliance. So we're going to be going through that today. So there's a bit of information about that. And we're also going to go through one of the most difficult standards where the majority of the non-compliances that are experienced are with standard 1.8, which is around assessment tools. Now, my video is not working very well, so I'm going to turn my video off. So I'll wave goodbye and we'll just have my audio because the video is just very distorted. Okay, so the webinar today will be about standard 1.8, which is around assessment tools, 1.9, 1.10, 1.11, 1.12, which is around assessment validation. ASQA have actually identified that the number one non-compliance at audit is standard 1.8, which is around assessment tools. So it's very important that we get this right. The other major non-compliance is around trainers and assessors, but we'll focus on assessment tools today. Okay, so as per usual, this webinar forms part of your continuous improvement process. You should review your policies and procedures on these standards that we are going through today. You should minute that you have attended this webinar on your quality and compliance meeting. For our clients who will be attending their first initial registration audit, this is evidence that you have implemented the policies and procedures into your organisation by stating that you have attended these webinars, and you can minute it in your meetings so that you can confirm that you have actually attended the webinar. For everyone who's attended today on the live webinar, they will receive, and we've got 13 participants today, which is excellent, you will receive a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, which you can use as professional development. So once you have completed attending this webinar, you should minute these in your quality and compliance meeting, which you'll find under standard 2.2 in your Q&C manual. So as per your policies and procedures, if you identify that you are not following these policies and procedures, you should update your policies and procedures, or or it might be that you need to implement some continuous improvement into your organisation. So you should review it and identify whether there's anything that you need to update. Okay, so the first item that we'll be going through today is clause 8.4, which is your annual declaration of compliance. This annual stat dec is due to be submitted by the 31st of March at the end of this month. So within the standards for RTOs, every RTO, and it's the CEO's responsibility, is required to sign off an annual declaration of compliance to state that their RTO, it's not that whether you're compliant or not, it's that you have reviewed your policies and procedures and your processes and identified whether there's any opportunities for improvement in there. That's the purpose of it. The idea is that you should be giving at least once a year a review of everything that you're doing within your organisation and do a check to see if you are complying with that, with each standard within the standards for RTOs. ASQA will notify the CEO as per the CEO details on training.gov.au by email of your obligation to complete this declaration. So what you need to do, if you have not, because we know we've got clients who have received this notification from ASQA. If you have not received the notification for ASQA, go on to training.gov.au and check out that your CEO's contact details on training.gov.au is correct, because it could be that you have changed the details of the CEO, the email address has changed, or there may be other contact details have changed, but the main one is the CEO. So you need to update your training.gov.au, which is you do that through ASQA.net, going on to ASQA.net, and make sure that you have correct details. Now, what if you didn't receive the email from ASQA? So if you haven't received the email from ASQA, you need to do the following. Check your spam or junk mail folder, because it may be in there. Check that your email address is correct as per training.gov.au. And if this address is incorrect, first you need to update your details by going into ASQA.net and updating the details for your CEO in there. And that should be a material change of event, or it's a minor detail change that you'll be doing. And then you need to get in contact with inquiries@asqa.gov.au to advise them that you did not receive your annual stat declaration, and ask them to resend the email to you. If you have previously unsubscribed from ASQA emails, you'll need to contact web.feedback@asqa.gov.au, and ASQA will reactivate your subscription to ASQA emails. But you need to actually go to them, because it may be that you unsubscribed and you're no longer getting emails from them. It could be that you may have accidentally blocked them as well. So you might want to check who you've blocked and check that you haven't blocked asqa.gov.au. If none of the above apply, you will need to contact the ASQA Info Helpline on 1300 701 801 and advise that you have not received the email with regards to your annual declaration of compliance. So I'd just like to do a quick poll, and we'll just see if, create a new poll. Have you received your annual declaration? Compliance, yep. ASQA, yes. No, I'd like to just see who's received it yet, and that way you can actually all see, everyone on here can actually see whether who has received theirs yet. So if I'll quickly get you to pop in there yes or no, and if yes, okay, we've got a couple of no's. If yes, if you're on initial registration, I just thought I'd better say that. If you're on initial registration and we haven't submitted you yet to ASQA, you will not receive this email. You won't get it until you are actually registered as an RTO. So I'll let you know that we'll go. No, not yet. Could be with CEO. She hasn't said it yet. Okay. Someone has just stated, no, they haven't received it yet. Could be with the CEO and she hasn't forwarded on yet. So that's the other thing, is you want to check with your CEO to make sure that they've received the email in the first place. I've received the link to complete it online. Yeah, so it's just a link to go online. That's all it is. You'll have a link to go online, but I'm just going to quickly go through the process on how to answer the questions for the annual stat deck. Okay, so we've got 3 people have said yes, they've received it. 4 people have said no. Some are not applicable because they are still initial registrations. Of the 3 that said yes, not sure, could be with the CEO. Yeah, so track down the CEO. If you're not the CEO, you need to track down with the CEO and make sure that they received it. More often than not, it gets missed. And if you do not submit the annual stat deck, you're actually non-compliant. So you want to make sure that you have submitted it. So check that you have. And you've lodged it. So yes, I have lodged the annual declaration. Okay, so if you've lodged it, that's fine. You have until the midnight on the 31st of March to submit your annual stat deck online. So the clause states that you need to be compliant with all the standards at all times. So that's one of the requirements of being the CEO of an RTO. So when you submit your declaration of compliance, you're stating that you currently meet the requirements of the standards across all your scope of registration for the last 12 months, and that you have training and assessment strategies in place and that they are current and that you are following them and that you've undertaken current industry consultation for those industry surveys, training and assessment strategies, because you should be updating your training and assessment strategies at least once a year to ensure that they're updated on a regular basis. And the training and assessment strategies should reflect what you're actually doing, how you're actually delivering and assessing your training and assessment. Okay, so when an RTO submits this declaration, they're confirming with ASQA that all records held by ASQA pertaining to its business of operation. If your CEO details are not current on training.gov.au, that means you're non-compliant, because you need to actually update your details. You need to notify ASQA within 90 calendar days of any changes for the CEO. So that includes their email address. If you change locations, you need to notify ASQA of that. So there are a few things that you need to notify ASQA within 90 calendar days of that change. So you need to check that your details on training.gov.au is accurate. So one of the things I recommend you do, if you can, while you're online right now, is jump onto training.gov.au and look up your RTO and just check all those details are correct. If any of them are incorrect, you need to go onto ASQAnet and update the details there. If you don't know how to do that, just get in contact with any of our CLOs here, and they'll be able to assist you as part of your membership. They're also confirming that you're systematically monitoring your compliance. So that means you should be conducting at least an annual audit, or having someone, preferably external from your organisation, someone like Vivacity, who could come in and audit your RTO and undertake a site audit of your compliance against the standards for RTOs. They are also checking that you have implemented preventative and corrective actions where necessary. So they're not stating that you just tick, yes, we're compliant, because if you state tick yes, that you are compliant, and then they come in and audit you at a later date and find non-compliances, and particularly if it was prior to when you submitted your annual stat deck, that they can actually fine you for that. They can actually make you non-compliant for for declaring that you were compliant, but you weren't actually compliant because you had non-compliances. The preventative and corrective action is they want to identify. So for each question, basically they're going to go through, it's an online form that you complete, and they go through each standard, and they're asking you, are you currently compliant, something like that, with clause 1.1, which is that you'll have training and assessment strategies in place for each qualification listed on your scope of registration. That's just an example of one. If you do not have current, they're not current and they're not up to date, the preventative and corrective action is that you identified that your TASs are out of date and they need to be updated, and the corrective action is that you've put a strategic plan in place to update your policies, your TASs, to ensure that they're in line with how you are actually delivering your training and assessment right now. So that gives you an idea of what you need to do when you're submitting your stat deck. So one member tried to submit an annual stat deck today, but had an error message and went to ASQA website and said, access denied, login, advised to contact ASQA. So we have had someone, so that's Angie who's just put that in there, that question. She just said that we have had someone who tried to submit and there was an error code. So it sounds like ASQA may be having some issues. But we did have another client. When did you submit your stat deck? I'm wondering whether the issue is just today, or is it has it been for a little while? But we have had someone who has actually submitted their annual stat deck, so it must be working. Last week. Okay, so it must be an issue they're having with this week. So maybe hold off. You've got until the end of March. Don't hold it off too late, but you should commence it and try and submit. I think you can save it under your email address, because we've had one of our other clients do it today, start it today. So I think you can save it under your email address. Unfortunately, we can't actually get in. We can only see screenshots of what one of our clients has actually tried to submit today. We can't actually see it ourselves because only RTOs can see it. So, yeah, so I'm going to try and see if I can find that. I think, Angie, you sent that to me today. Just see, we had a client who was asking about submitting their annual stat deck today. Let me just see if I can find it. And I'll have a look at what that PowerPoint says. Anyway, I might get Angie, I might get you to send that to me again so that I can have a look at that. Thanks. Yes, but did not have a screenshot. Oh, okay. Okay. All right, we'll have a look at that. The best way to ensure that you are compliant is to undertake an internal audit. So we said that all non-compliances should be recorded as an opportunity for improvement and minuted in your monthly Q&C meeting. So how do you complete the annual declaration form? So the CEO will receive the email to your registered CEO email address as per training.gov.au, containing a unique link to an online form. So it's actually linked to your RTO ID. So you can't use someone else's form. You have to use your own form and go online and submit it yourself. The form will be available from the beginning of February, so it's available now until the end of March. This allows each provider 2 months to undertake a self-assessment required to complete the declaration. So you have till the 31st of March, midnight, Australian Eastern Standard Time. So you can save the online form and return to it at any time before the end of March. So you can commence it and then go back to it. What happens if you don't complete the annual declaration? So ASQA actually states as part of clause 8.4 of the standards that you must submit your annual declaration. If you do not submit the declaration, ASQA has the right to take further regulatory action, which puts your RTO at risk of non-compliance and possible cancellation of your registration. So what to complete? You need to complete the form honestly. It doesn't matter if you have any non-compliances. They're not going to go, bang, you have non-compliances, we're going to come in and audit you. They're not going to do that. What they want to do is that you are actually reviewing your systems and that you are compliant against each of the standards. So it doesn't matter if you have any non-compliances. They're not going to go, bang, you've got non-compliances, we're going to come out and audit you. They want to see what corrective action have you taken when you've identified, or what are you going to implement when you've identified that there is a non-compliance. So if you have any non-compliances, you should include in your form that you're submitting to ASQA, what action are you going to take to fix it, to fix that non-compliance. If you have identified any opportunities for improvement, you need to add these to the report that you've identified it as an opportunity for improvement and that it's in your opportunities for improvement process. So the best policy is honesty. Make sure that you're honest with it to the best of your knowledge. Now, the best way to actually identify is either conduct an internal audit or get someone external, so someone like Vivacity to come in and do an audit to actually check against every standard what is your compliance. Now, one thing that we recommend is you should have an internal audit once a year at least to check your compliance against all of the standards within your RTO, so all your policies and procedures and your processes against the standards for RTOs, at least on an annual basis to check. We call them systems checks, and the reason why is we're checking your systems to ensure that they are compliant with the standards. Okay, so that's it about the annual declaration of compliance. Did anybody have any questions about the annual stat deck? If you do, please pop them in the chat box. If you don't, I'm going to move on to assessment tools because it's actually quite comprehensive what we've got to talk about today. Okay. All right, doesn't look like we've got any questions. I couldn't find the email that we got today. Angie didn't send it over to me, so I haven't got it there. I think I deleted it. But the screenshots is, so basically those points that I've gone through is what you need to address. So make sure that you address each of the clauses and that you identify what is compliant, what is not compliant. Can the general manager fill in for the CEO? So you can fill it in for the CEO, that's fine. If the CEO wants to designate another staff member to complete the form on their behalf, that's fine. But ultimately, the CEO is responsible for the form. So if there's any non-compliances or you have completed the form incorrectly or the designated person has submitted the form incorrectly, it is on the CEO, it's the CEO's responsibility. So they need to know and understand that they are responsible for the annual declaration of compliance, and if they delegate the task to someone else, they're still responsible. So yes, you can, because they're not going to know who actually signed it. They don't take photo ID or a photo of you or anything like that. They're not going to know who submitted the form. I think it is when you sign it off, you actually sign it off as the CEO. So you'll be signing off on behalf of the CEO. So yes, you can, but it's still the CEO's responsibility. Okay, thanks. All right, excellent. So that's the only question I got. All right, on to standard 1.8. So standard 1.8 is the RTO implements an assessment system that ensures that assessment, including recognition of prior learning, complies with the assessment requirements of the relevant training package. So that's outlined in training.gov.au and is conducted in accordance with the principal assessment and rules of evidence. Now, if you've attended one of our workshops on assessment validation, I really break down the principal assessment and rules of evidence within that workshop. I'm going to do a smaller version of that today, so it's going to be a refresher for those who've done the workshop, but I will be touching on that today. Where majority of the non-compliances are with regards to rules of evidence and principal assessment is most people don't actually know what they mean. And basically the rules of evidence and principal assessment layer themselves over the unit of competency. So I'll go through that today. I'll give you a better understanding of that today. So the top non-compliances at audit, and this is according to ASQA, and it's also what we've seen when we've gone to audit, is generally the assessment tools. They're the most non-compliant. And generally it's because the tools do not address the performance criteria or assessment requirements. And one of the things that we've really identified a lot lately is that the assessment tools do not address the foundation skills, and in particular communication skills, oral communication, written communication, but there's not sufficient observation checklists or demonstration checklists or any mechanism in place to collect evidence that the student has the communication skills required to deliver, to be assessed as competent within that unit. So that's where we're finding the majority of the non-compliances when we're validating assessment tools ourselves. And I'm going to actually have a look at a unit today, so I'll show you what I mean by that. Okay. So tools have not been contextualized to the learner cohort. So you should have identified who your typical learner cohort is. So if they're non-English speaking background, or if they're low language and literacy, or they're from a certain cultural background, you should have assessment tools that actually address that learner cohort. So, and it should be contextualized to that learner cohort. One of the other non-compliances that we've identified is tools not being validated, and the RTO does not have a mapping tool, or when unable to show to the auditor where the tool addresses the performance criteria and assessment requirements. So the assessment tools must meet the training package requirements as per training.gov.au, and they must address the performance criteria within each unit of competency and the assessment requirements of each unit of competency. A lot of the qualifications and units of competencies listed on training.gov.au right now also have a companion guide that's been provided by the SSO. So you should check out that companion guide when you're looking at when you're validating your assessment tools on training.gov.au. So I'm just going to quickly go share my screen so that you can actually see what I mean by, all right, hold on, we'll go to that one. So you can see what I mean by what's listed in the training package. So I've got a single unit that I'm having a look at right now. So that single unit is participate in assessment validation. And in here, you'll see it has a companion volume. So companion volume and implementation guides are found on VetNet. So you can actually click on that and it will take you to the companion guide. Then when you go to the unit, you'll actually see the unit of competency. So it's an outline of the unit and this is the performance criteria that you should be assessing against that unit of competency. So your assessment tools need to address each one of, and more importantly, the performance criteria within each unit of competency. So when you validate your tools, you're checking that the tool actually addresses this performance criteria within the unit of competency, within your assessment tools. So this one is check all documents used in the validation process for accuracy and version control. So I'd want to see in the assessment tool some mechanism where you are collecting evidence that the student knows how to check all documents used in the validation process for accuracy and version control. Need to understand what version control is. They'd need to understand what is accurate information on your validation process. And this is the area where I was talking about, where we're finding the majority of the non-compliances when we're validating assessment tools is foundation skills. And what I'm finding is auditors are really targeting this when they go to audit, is they're really looking at foundation skills because there's still a lot of assessment tools out there. I'm talking about purchased ones in particular, where you buy them from a publisher, not addressing the foundation skills. So they don't have sufficient evidence that they're collecting in their assessment tool that the student has these foundation skills. In particular is oral communication. We're finding a lot of non-compliances in assessment tools where they don't have a mechanism in place to collect evidence against oral communication. So in this one under the TAE unit, it's saying it's within the performance criteria 1.1, 1.4, 2.1, 2.2, so this section here. What we should be looking for in your assessment tool with this unit of competency in particular is communicates with others to confirm approaches, exchange ideas and information, articulate opinions and reach agreement with others using suitable tone, style and language. So what I'd be expecting is the assessment tool should include how are you collecting evidence that the student can communicate all this? Were they able to articulate their opinion? Were they able to reach agreement with others in communication skills? Did they use? Did they clarify? Were they able to listen and take action? Were they able to follow instructions when they get those when they are following through on that? So this should be an observation. You should be observing the student doing this, and there should be some sort of observation checklist and feedback that you're providing to the student on how well that they communicated. So I would expect, if I was looking at the assessment tools for this unit of competency, that there would be a oral or observation checklist that you're using. So it might be oral questioning that you're asking, or it might be you are role playing and then you're providing feedback following how they communicated that information to you. So I'd expect for this unit in particular that the student should provide you that video, so they can provide a video of them conducting assessment validation, and you are watching their communication skills and then assessing them on those communication skills in the video. So they submit a video and you have an assessment checklist that you go through to identify that they meet this requirement of the foundation skills. So that just gives you a breakdown of what to expect when you're validating your assessment tools, and when you're looking at your assessment tools, do they meet all these requirements? And this is a huge one, is this oral communication. Writing here, so there should be somewhere in the assessment evidence that you're collecting that they're recording key information from the validation process accurately to meet requirements. So I'd want to see needed validation report. That's what I'd want to see there. So then we've also got assessment requirements. So this is the assessment requirements. So it's saying in the performance end of evidence that the candidate must show evidence of the ability to complete tasks outlined in the elements and performance criteria of this unit, including actively participating in a minimum of 3 validation sessions. So I know that the assessment tool and the evidence you're collecting should be that the student has attended a minimum of 3 validation sessions that addresses the critical aspects of validation. So I'd want to see evidence of 3 validation sessions that they've attended, and they should be leading and facilitating assessment validation as well. Clearly identifying the purpose for each validation and the legal and ethical responsibilities of the assessor. So that would be a written one, so knowledge-based question. Collecting and presenting documentation for validation in a logical manner. So it could be a report that they're providing. Communicating and liaising with relevant people. So I'd want a observation checklist that they know how to communicate effectively, or email correspondence that they're doing as well, or could be meeting minutes or the notes that they've taken at the validation session. Providing feedback and interpreting documentation in the validation sessions. So I'd want an observation checklist. I'd want to hear their oral communication skills, and there should be evidence that you are collecting that the student knows how to provide feedback and interpret documentation. So you need to have a look at your assessment tools and identify, do you have sufficient evidence to demonstrate that they are getting that? No, getting through choppy. Oh, okay. Just to let you know, all webinars are recorded, so you'll get access to a recorded copy of this webinar, recorded. So if you're having any issues with the sound, you can watch this again. You can watch the recording. Generally, it's because generally the sound is due to internet connection. Anybody else having any issues with sound? I've only got one person at the moment. Okay, so that's that one. Yep, okay. So is that a yes, Sylvia, you're having sound problems, or yes, you're hearing me? Okay, so we're going to go back to the PowerPoint. Better now. Okay, excellent. All right, no problem. Excellent. Having sound problems intermittently. Okay, yeah, okay. It can depend on your internet access there, but this will be recorded and you'll have access to the recording. Okay, so assessment tools must address all of those. I hope that explains how, when you're looking at your assessment tools and you're validating your assessment tools, that you need to really look at that performance evidence, and you really need to look at the performance criteria and foundation skills. Very have a look at foundation skills. Okay, when you're purchasing assessment tools, don't assume that because you've purchased assessment tools that they're going to be compliant, because you know they're going to be better than if you've produced your own. Way better. You're going to be leaps and bounds ahead than producing your own. Sometimes you have to produce your own because there's nothing else out there. What we recommend is you purchase and then contextualize assessment tools to meet your needs. I think that's the best method. Why reinvent the wheel when there's a wheel that can be improved on? So you can buy a wheel and improve on that, or buy assessment tools and improve on that. So when you are purchasing your assessment tools, before you purchase, you should have a look at the assessment tools and identify, do they address the requirements of the UOC? Have they been developed by a reputable organisation? There are some organisations out there that have a bad name with ASQA, and as soon as they see that you have bought them from that publisher, the audit goes downhill from there. I'm not going to name and shame who in particular they are, but if you ask your CELO at Vivacity, they'll well and truly let you know what is a reputable organisation and what is not. But with assessment tools, you need to be really careful that they address the unit of competency requirements. And some of the things that I would ask the publisher is, have their tools been to audit before? Have they been successful at audit? And most importantly, will they rectify their assessment tools if they're non-compliant at audit? Now, if they do rectify, if they're non-compliant at audit, I would feel more confident with them that they will actually provide quality assessment tools, because they're willing to modify it like we are. We guarantee all of our policies, procedures, forms and documentation, because if they're non-compliant at audit, that is not what we want. We want to be 100% compliant at audit. We will rectify, and we do not charge any extra for that. And the reason why is because we see it as an opportunity for improvement, and we'll fix it for that audit. We don't wait and say, oh, we'll put that on our list of registers to be fixed at a later date. We fix it now, because it's really important that we get onto it straight away and fix it and ensure that it meets ASQA requirements, and that it is collecting sufficient evidence to deem a student competent. Because if you collect evidence and you're using assessment tools that doesn't collect sufficient evidence, the risk that you have is that you have to cancel every certificate that you've issued for that unit that was non-compliant. And which then causes refunds, and you put your RTO at risk of cancellation, or you could have a sanction placed on your RTO where you can no longer deliver certain units or qualifications on your scope of registration. So you want to make sure that you have good assessment tools in place and that you're collecting sufficient evidence from every student that is completing an assessment that they are competent against the performance criteria and the assessment conditions within the unit of competency. Now, I will get on to principles of assessment and rules of evidence and how that layers on top of the unit of competency. So we're getting there. So are they suitable for your target audience? So you need to have a look at your assessment tools. Do they meet your the existing skills and knowledge of your students? If they're non-English speaking background, will you need to actually fix that? Is there something that you need to adjust the assessment tools so that they actually meet the learner cohort requirements, their existing skills and knowledge? So when you're validating your assessment, this is where rules of evidence and principle assessment come in. You really need to validate, well, okay, this meets the performance criteria requirements and this meets the assessment condition requirements, but does it meet our learner cohort requirements? Is it fair? Is it flexible? Is it reliable? Is it authentic? Is the evidence we're collecting authentic? So you need to really identify that. Are they suitable for the learner cohort? Will students be able to access the internet to complete assessments? So if you're making it a requirement that they've got to complete assessments online, how are you ensuring that they have the mechanisms in place to complete those assessments online? So there's lots of things that you need to take into consideration. So we get asked a lot about assessment tools. So we've actually included a link on our website. So if you go to our website and go under useful links, training resources, you'll actually find a list of resources that we recommend. So there's a range of different assessment tools that you can access there. And if you have any questions about them, please get in contact with your client liaison officer and they'll give you their honest feedback on what they think about the assessment tools that they've had experience with. So what should you purchase? You should purchase a learner guide to assessment, so a guide to the student on how they're going to be assessed, an assessor guide to the assessment, so it's instructions to the assessor on how to conduct the assessment. It should include a mapping tool so that the assessment tools have been mapped against each performance criteria and assessment condition. This makes it it's not compulsory, but it makes it much easier when you go to validate your tools at a later date. So it makes make your life much easier if you have that in there, and it's also really good for audit. You should have textbooks in place or some sort of material that you're using for the delivery of training. So it's what the trainer uses to deliver the training, and you want to make sure that the textbooks or the training materials that you're using are actually delivering information that is the same and relevant information as per the assessment requirements. So it's better off you're getting textbooks that actually address the unit of competency requirements. So the training resources, so when you go on to training.gov.au and you have a look at the unit of competency, it will actually tell you what resources you'll need to purchase to deliver or have in place for assessing the student against that unit of competency. So for example, with first aid, they have face masks and bandages. You should have all of that equipment in place. That's part of your training resources when you're delivering that training and assessment, and that should be on your training and assessment strategy as well. You don't have to have PowerPoint presentations, but I recommend it. If you're anything like me, if I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, I tend to go off on a tangent and it can take me a long time to get back to where I was supposed to be. So I have to have a PowerPoint to keep me on track. Anyway, that's just me. Okay, so one of the things that I recommend, and this is in the workshop when you come along to the workshop as well, is register on training.gov.au to get updates for all qualifications and or units of competencies that you are delivering. The other thing you can do is if you're already an RTO, you can register to get updates about your RTO. So if there's anything changes about any qualifications on your scope of registration, you'll get notified by training.gov.au of any of those changes. So I highly recommend that you register on TGA. If you need any information about how to register on TGA, we actually have, when you come along to our workshop, we actually include it in our workbook, how to register on TGA, but you can also get in contact. I don't think I can attach any documents here, but if you get in contact with your CLO, we actually have a little booklet on how to register on TGA, but it's pretty simple. You just sign in, go to this sign in button at the top right-hand corner there, and it will give you instructions on what to do. Okay, so that's assessment tools and the importance of what to have in it. Now, 1.9 to 1.12, actually, I overlap a lot of what I just discussed. Now we're validating the assessment tools. So I'm going to talk about the importance of validating your assessment tools. It's actually a requirement within these standards that you must validate 50%, at least 50% of your assessment tools within the first 3 years of your registration. And within every 5 year, everything should be validated within a 5-year period. So every unit of competency, every assessment tool that you have in place needs to be validated within a 5-year period. And they're really targeting this now for re-registration and post-initial audits. So if you are coming up for your post-initial or re-registration audit, you need to make sure that you are conducting assessment validation. You were provided, if you were a Kickstart client of ours, you were provided with an assessment validation schedule. If you are a member, all current members can access the assessment validation schedule through Unicorn. There is an assessment validation template, schedule template that you can access through Unicorn. We recommend that you have one in place, and it should be for a 5-year period. So for the purposes of these clauses, vocational competency, so when you are, the team who is validating their assessment tools need to be qualified. So they need to be qualified trainers and assessors and have some industry experience. I'll go a bit further into that. So how do you ensure that your tools are compliant? The best way to ascertain if your assessment tool is compliant is to validate your tools against the unit of competency, performance criteria, assessment conditions, rules of evidence, and principle assessment. So the rules of evidence is the evidence that you're collecting. How are you ensuring that the evidence that you're collecting is valid? So the assessment is valid when the process is sound and assesses what it claims to assess and reflects the actual requirements of the benchmark. Sufficient. Have you collected sufficient evidence to demonstrate that the student is competent within that unit of competency? So it should be, and this is what you're doing, you got to collect sufficient evidence that the student demonstrates it against each performance criteria, the assessment conditions, and the foundation skills. So you really need, that's where you can be non-compliant against the rules of evidence, is that you didn't have sufficient evidence to collect it. And how do you determine sufficiency? Sufficiency is, you should be able, it should address every part element within the performance criteria. So performance criteria within the element should address every assessment condition, and it should address every foundation skill within the outline of the unit of competency. You really need to read the unit of competency, because sometimes, like the one that we just read for TAE, is actively participating in a minimum of 3 validation sessions. So if you were only collecting evidence that they attended 2 validation sessions, that wouldn't be sufficient evidence, because the performance evidence states that it must be 3. So you really need to look at every unit of competency and make sure that you're collecting sufficient evidence against those. We often get clients who come to us who state, we've got all these assessment tools and we purchased them, but we don't want to do every assessment because it's too much for the student. Well, yes, you can reduce down the amount of assessments, but are you collecting sufficient evidence? Are you collecting evidence against every performance criteria, every assessment condition, and every foundation skill? If you are not, so if you decide you want to remove some of the assessments, you really need to identify, well, have we sufficiently collected evidence against all of those? Now, it could be you could cluster your assessments. There's no problems with clustering. And what I mean by that is you might have 3 units of competencies that are very similar, and you could conduct, or maybe 2 assessments around those 3 units of competencies and collect evidence against every performance criteria for the 3 units of competencies. So that's one way you can reduce how many assessments you're conducting and the evidence that you're collecting. But you need to be careful whenever you decide you're going to reduce the amount of assessments. make sure that you are still collecting sufficient evidence against the performance criteria, assessment conditions, and foundation skills. The other one is authenticity. How are you ensuring that the evidence that you're collecting is that student's own work? This is in particular if you're looking at portfolio of evidence or RPL, recognition of prior learning, or if you're getting the student to collect evidence in the workplace. How are you ensuring that the evidence that they're collecting, that they can perform that task or have completed an assessment item within the workplace? So one thing would be to get a supervisor to sign a third-party supervisor report. The other one is to get them to sign a cover sheet. We have an assessment cover sheet that the students can use that declares that the assessment, everything in their assessment is their own work. It is just a stat deck that states that it is their own work, but it is something you can use against them if you find out later that it wasn't their own work. So they make a declaration that it is their own work. And then the other one is if you're collecting evidence of prior skills and knowledge, the certificates you're collecting that you've you've certified that you've eyewitnessed the original certificate that is cited. Sorry, you've cited the original certificate, or you have cited a certified copy of that certificate. So if you're using certificates as part of your evidence that you're collecting, you should cite the original. That's the best way. Current. So how are you ensuring that the evidence that you're collecting is current? So in particular, if you're doing, if you're looking at portfolio of evidence or recognition of prior learning, it's really only within the last 3 years that it's current. So currency here is they're talking about the evidence has been collected within the last 3 years, and that it's against the performance criteria and assessment conditions as well. So, and it's current with industry requirements. It's current with their organisational requirements. It's current against the training package requirements. If they've got a credit transfer, is the unit that they're asking for a credit transfer from current and a direct equivalent to the current unit of competency? So they're the different things you need to look at when you're looking at currency. Okay, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat box. I know I'm firing through here, but if you have any questions, please post them in the chat box there. Principles of assessment. So principle assessment is how are you conducting the assessment? So evidence of assessment, rules of evidence, is the evidence that you've already collected. So you've collected this evidence that the student is competent against this unit of competency. The principles of assessment is how you're conducting the assessment. So is it fair how you're conducting the assessment? It's all about considering and making sure that appropriate changes for your preferred assessment method is catered to the skills and knowledge of the student. So it addresses the skills and knowledge. Another way to make sure that it's fair is you have a marking guide. So an assessor's marking guide that actually has suggested answers for each unit of competency or each assessment task. So that's another way you make it fair. You want to make it fair by having consistent how you are collecting that evidence. Flexibility is how can you adjust the training or the assessment assessment evidence that's been collected for workplace, for example, or on the job, or meeting needs for a specific industry audience. So do you have another flexibility is adjusting training to meet student needs. So it might be that they have a minor disability. So it could be something like colour blindness and you need to change their documentation so it's in black and white or something like that. Or the student is able to wear specific glasses. There are also glasses that you can get specifically for Asperger's and ADHD, which assists students to be able to read. So you can be flexible around that as long as it's not going to interfere with, once they are in the workplace, are they able to wear those glasses in the workplace? So you need to be flexible, but they still need to be able to utilise that skill that they've been assessed competent in. They should have the same conditions when they're in the workplace. Okay, so that's flexibility. Validity is defined as the extent to which the instrument measures what it states to measure and must address the entire unit of competency. So the evidence that the way you're collecting assessment or you're conducting the assessment is valid to the industry requirements, it's valid against the training package requirements, it's valid against the performance criteria and assessment conditions, and it meets the range of students that you have in the classroom. So you'll see a lot of the rules of evidence and principle assessment layer upon each other. They're not treated as individual aspects, but they really do layer on top of each other with the unit of competency, performance criteria and assessment conditions. Reliable. There must be a common interpretation amongst assessors and consistency in their judgments made and repeated trials. So how do we ensure that the evidence that we're collecting or the way we're conducting the assessment is reliable? Make it clear to the assessor how they must conduct the assessment. What equipment will they need? What time frame will they need? How are they going to conduct it? Do they need to have interview process? Will there be observation? Will it be just a written base? There should be instructions to the assessor how they're going to conduct the assessment, and then the evidence that they're going to collect. Okay, so that's rules of evidence and principle assessment. That's a real snapshot. The workshop that we do on assessment validation goes into that much deeper. We spend quite a few hours on that, breaking that down. Assessment validation schedule. So the standards state that you should have a plan in place for assessment validation, and we have a policy and procedure on that. I've got an example there of the validation schedule is. It must include all the units of competencies on your scope of registration. It should include every assessment tool that you have against each unit of competency. It should identify who is the lead facilitator of the validation team, and dates of the actual pre and post assessment validation. So I recommend that you go and have a look at the policy and procedure for that and make sure that you actually have a validation schedule in place, firstly. If you are a prior client of ours and you do have an assessment validation schedule, is it current? Have you actually conducted any validation since you got your registration? You need to have a look at actually identify whether you need to actually conduct some assessment validation. So when you hold the meetings, your schedule should include when you will validate, so what date, month, you can do it by month. We recommend that this should be conducted at least twice a year. You should hold 2 validation sessions twice a year. I recommend that you choose slower times of the year, like January or mid-year, June, July. But you'll know better with your own RTO when is the slower time of the year. You'll need about 2 hours for your first assessment tool and about an hour for every assessment tool after that. Once you get your head around one assessment tool, it does go quicker once you start validating. It's best to validate 4 tools in one setting because you'll actually go through quite quick once you've finished the first one. The first one always takes the longest, but once you get through the first one, the other ones will go through much quicker. So what you'll need to have every assessment tool for each unit of competency that you will be validating. You need to go to training.gov.au. So what I did earlier when I looked up the unit of competency on training.gov.au, then I looked at the assessment conditions and I looked at the unit of competency outline. You'll need to download those. I recommend you download and print those, and I recommend that you print the assessment tools as well and you write on them. And that will be your evidence when you go to audit that you have validated your assessment tools. Now, you can scan them and save them to your server. You don't have to keep the hard copy, but I highly recommend, it's much easier when you're validating a team that you write on the tools. The other one I do is I have a PDF copy and I put comments all the way through. So I put a comment against the performance criteria and the assessment tool and I map them together. So whenever I put one against the performance criteria, I'll put it against the assessment tool as well, so that it makes it easier to amend the assessment tool at a later date. Assessment processes including the instructions to the student and the assessor, and you should have your mapping tool as well. You'll need to complete an assessment validation report. This is on Unicorn, so you can download the assessment validation report from Unicorn. I've made a couple of minor changes to the validation report from last year, which is the one we've got there. So I'm going to have a quick squeeze at the assessment validation report so you can have a look at that. Okay, so I've got the assessment validation report that's coming up. It'll be up soon. Okay, this is the report here. So you put in the unit of competency name here, what the name of the assessment tools that you're validating, the date of the validation. Is it pre-assessment validation? So pre-assessment validation is before you start using that assessment tool. You've got no completed assessment tools, they're blank. You're just looking at the tool purely against the performance criteria and assessment conditions. You've got post-assessment validation, which is a bit like moderation, what we used to call moderation, where you're looking at the assessment tool and you're moderating against different answers from different students, and you're also moderating between different assessors and ensuring that you have consistency with your rules of evidence and principle assessment for your post-assessment validation. On your assessment validation panel, you should have on the validation panel that addresses each one of these. So you can have one person that has the relevant vocational competencies and current industry skills, which could be an industry expert. You could have another one who's a trainer assessor or has current knowledge and skills in VET teaching and learning. You can have another person who holds the Cert 4 in training and assessment, or at least the TAESS assessor skill set. The person who signs off on the assessment validation was not involved in the assessment process. So they're an external person who didn't actually mark those assessments. So that's for post-assessment validation. For pre-assessment validation, it doesn't matter, but post-assessment, it should be someone who wasn't involved in the assessment validation process. Number 5 is an industry expert with a MES industry experience within the relevant industry. Now, you could have someone who is all 5 of these, who could validate the tools. We've done independent validation. I've done independent validation where I had all 5. I was validating for an RTO. It was business qualifications, and I had all 5, so I could do the validation by myself and sign off by myself. But when you fill this in, you're putting each panel member in here, you're getting them to sign, and you tick these boxes as per these numbers here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're ticking the boxes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So who has what, who addresses what in this panel requirements. Then we go, we've actually got the process in there on how to conduct the assessment validation. This aligns with the policies and procedures in the Q&C. And then we have, this is the validation process. So we're actually validating the assessment tool against the principal assessment rules of evidence. And we're also looking at the unit competency requirements. And then on the last page, this is for post-assessment validation. We include the names of the student files that we looked at. What unit did we validate? What feedback have you got for that individual student on the validation of their assessment tool? So the way I recommend it is you validate the blank tool first to identify if there's any gaps, and then you go to the assessment tool completed ones and have a look at the completed ones and then provide feedback on that. Did you collect sufficient evidence? So if there was some gaps in the assessment tool, did you collect sufficient evidence anyway through other assessments that you conducted to deem the student competent? Because if you didn't, you're going to have a rectification process where you are actually collecting further evidence from those students to ensure that they meet the assessment criteria requirements. So what action did you take? Did you have to do a rectification? Did you have to undertake further assessment? Was it that you just needed? So this action here pertains to this actual student file, not to it's to the actual student file. Was there anything that you needed to do? Did you need to conduct further assessment? Did you need to collect further evidence? Who assessed it? So who was the person who assessed that assessment tool, and who validated? So who was the assessor? And who was the person who validated this assessment tool? On the front page of the report, we actually have recommendations. So that's what you do for your recommendations for the assessment tool. So what recommendations do you have against that assessment tool? The validation report. Okay, so we'll just get back to the PowerPoint. Almost there. So if you do identify any rectification, that should be recorded in your opportunity for improvement as an opportunity for improvement and minuted at your monthly meeting. So the validation team, I've already gone through that. So who is the validation team? The assessment validation facilitator is responsible for leading the assessment validation meeting, is responsible for the organisation of the assessment validation meeting, actually coordinating it and booking it in and making sure that everybody's there. Providing guidelines for the assessors about the material to be used at validation meetings and how it should be collected and presented. Maintaining the records of the validation that was conducted. reviewing the validation process on a regular basis and modifying or improving the process as required, and completing and signing the assessment validation report. This is just a little graphic that I've got about, so you can't have the same assessor validate their own tools. So you can't, so if someone conducted the assessment, you have a trainer or assessor who conducted the assessment, they can't sign off. They can participate in the validation team, but they can't sign off on the assessment validation. Someone else has to sign off. So, but you can have assessors within the same organisation sign off on other assessors' validation. So if that makes sense there. But you can't sign off on your own assessment. Okay, so that's assessment validation. 1.12 is very simple. The RTO offers RPL. That's it, basically. You must have on your marketing material that you offer RPL and that you have a recognition of prior learning process with your assessment tools in place. So RPL strategies include you should have an RPL kit. You should have some sort of mechanism in place for collecting evidence for the recognition of prior learning. So you should have some sort of checklist there. We have an RPL kit in the Unicorn Docs, so you should download that, and you'll need to contextualize it. You can't use the RPL kit as it is. It's just a template that you can use if you don't have any RPL tools with the assessment tools that you have purchased or you've developed. You can use this RPL kit for developing your own. There's instructions in there on how to do it. And that RPL kit you give to the student for collecting evidence of their recognition of prior learning. So the evidence you can collect is prior certificates, workplace information, a resume, job description, portfolio of documents that they've provided, oral presentations. There's a range of evidence that you can collect of for evidence of RPL. That's it. That's it for today. So if you have any questions about any of those, please post them in the chat box. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar. I'm now going on to another webinar, so I'm going straight off this one into another one. So I hope you had learnt a lot during this session. Our next webinar will be on the 9th of April, and we'll be going through standards 1.13 to 1.20. That's all around trainers and assessors, which is the second most non-compliant standards at audit. So we'll be going through trainers and assessors, their skills and knowledge, how to complete a staff matrix, and what do they need to have in place, skills and knowledge and experience that they need to have in place. Okay, thank you very much for attending today's webinar. Please note that all webinars are recorded. You will be sent a link to the recording within the next couple of days. If you weren't able to watch this, you can watch the recording, or if you have anyone else on your team that you think would benefit from watching this webinar, please forward the link to them. We have no problems with that within your own organisation. You can't share it outside of your organisation, but you can share it within your organisation, not a problem. Our goal is to get you educated. We don't only consult, we coach you. This is a very important part of what we do at Vivacity, is we teach you how to do it. Not just a matter of here you go, sink or swim. It is, we want to teach you how to do it. I want all of our clients to be compliant. And the best way I can do that is by providing a mechanism, and webinars is the most important part, on how we can ensure that you are implementing these policies and procedures into your organisation, is by teaching you how to do it. So thank you very much for attending today. I look forward to catching up with you next month. So 7th of April, I think it was. I'll see you next month. Have a great month. A couple of clients I'm seeing soon in the next month. So I'll catch up with you then. Thank you very much for attending today. Bye.